The medical tint smelled of antiseptic and the kind of fatigue that clings to fabric and skin. Dr. Liam Reeves stared at a coffee machine that refused to become coffee, the final foe in a 16-hour shift that had already delivered plasma burns, fungal infections that glowed faintly in the dark, and a steady stream of humans and colonists with broken things that needed fixing. Florence, the medical AI installed on his wrist, chirped a polite reprimand. Liam, you are operating at 300% capacity. He ignored it, because the alarm barreling through the camp cut any introspection short. Captain Two's voice was thin with static. Crash site, 3 clicks northwest. Unknown vessel, possible survivors. Liam hefted the emergency kit he pretended was heavier than it ever felt and ran. The frontier didn't wait for coffee. It demanded decisions. They found the ship half buried in the rock, a thing of curves that gobbled light and spat geometry back in impossible angles. Sergeant Kwan's handheld pinged a single faint life sign from within. Liam exchanged a look with the sergeant. Surgical optimism. They sealed a perimeter, checked for conventional hazards, and entered. Inside, the wreck was less machine and more organism, wiring like tendons, panels like grown plates. Among the detritus lay a figure who might once have been ceremonial, fabric that refracted color and shimmered like water. She was humanoid, but not human. Long, elegant ears, skin that reflected starlight like a distant galaxy, eyes closed beneath lashes that caught the emergency beams. Silver blue blood pooled beneath a torn sleeve. Liam's scanner began a frantic symphony, overloaded by anatomy it couldn't reconcile. He worked in deliberate, practiced motions, clearing airway, assessing pulse, grafting synthetic skin, and carefully titrating analgesics. The alien physiology was efficient, cardiovascular systems that made his own textbooks feel crude. He spoke the same words he used on every patient. Small, human, grounding. You've had a really bad day. My name's Liam. I promise I've seen worse. Minutes felt like hours until vitals steadied. Liam slumped back on a crushed crate, the adrenaline finally ebbing. He had done what he always did, fix what he could, keep someone breathing. It was routine on the frontier, distilled into muscle memory and grit. And then she blinked. Her irises opened like galaxies, and for a moment the tense light became secondary to the scene in her eyes. The hand he had laid on her shoulder was suddenly weightier, charged with meaning he hadn't known existed. Her voice, when it came, was music, a language that folded into itself and then resolved into a strain of flawless Taran standard. The words cut his breath. Do you realize you are touching the queen of the galaxy, human? Liam's tired brain rewired itself around the new data. Patient. Queen. Sacrilege. The frontier had just handed him a diplomatic grenade wrapped in a patient's blanket. The revelation spun the rescue into a crisis. As Ashira's eyes tracked Liam's hand, confusion gave way to pain and then a brittle laugh. She explained, through careful, precise speech that blended courtly cadence and something like bitter amusement, that physical contact with the monarch was sacrilegious in Kaith law. Such rules had been shaped into ritual and distance so that the ruler existed as an icon rather than a person. The law enforced reverence by forbidding touch. Sergeant Kwan's comm crackled, and the rest of the FOB registered what had happened with immediate, practical terror. Doc, tell me you didn't just commit an interstellar incident, Kwan hissed. Liam, who had only meant to treat an injured sentient being, felt his stomach drop. In the vacuum between the field treatment and the base's sudden political mobilization, the situation moved from medical emergency to diplomatic minefield. Transport back to Arcturus was a blur of protocols being drafted faster than anyone had time to read them. Admirals arrived with austere faces and questions that tried to look like concern for the patient but read like crisis management. Xenoanthropologists, specialists in alien cultures, demanded interviews. They tasted the strange scent of precedent and legal hair-splitting. Commander Phillips, who always seemed older than his rank suggested, had the look of a man who had been pushed inside out by surprise. Ashira, for her part, was lucid enough to be dangerous. She sat wrapped in monitoring wires, watching Liam as he set up the equipment with a doctor's steady hands. She asked him to speak plainly. Her own healers had used ritualized verse, the kind of language that elevated the monarch into untouchable sculpture. Liam had treated her like a person, an act that in her world was unintentionally subversive. She admitted she hadn't been touched in 20 years since her coronation, when she had been transformed into icon, not individual. The Kaith Empire's initial messages were brutal and clear. An abomination had occurred, and its constitutional implications were severe. An official transmission demanded punitive measures. The word sacrilege echoed through the command center with legal weight, and the human hierarchy considered worst-case outcomes they hadn't yet named. Then came a second shock. Ashira invoked a rarely used legal clause, the right of sovereign protection. By that tradition, any who claimed a person under their sovereign protection could bind them to the royal household. Its precedents ranged from protection of assets to arrangements that, in less bureaucratic eras, looked suspiciously like forced unions. The language was archaic, but the effect was immediate. "He belongs to me now by law and by right," she declared, her voice a quiet gavel. In the room full of men and women trained to patch, plan, and command, the implications reverberated. Liam, who'd only meant to mend flesh, now faced ancient law, political theater, and a public whose reaction could swing from gratitude to outrage. The frontier had turned intimate medicine into statecraft. Shock gave way to negotiations. In the sterile conference rooms of FOB Arcturus, strategy replaced adrenaline as the currency. Admirals demanded briefings. Legal teams combed case precedents. Xenoanthropologists argued philosophy and etiquette against practical rescue ethics. Commander Phillips barked orders he later admitted he didn't fully understand. Through it all, Ashira sat with the quiet gravity of someone whose entire life had been curated into distance and ceremony. She could have demanded punishment. She could have demanded exile. Instead, beneath the ceremonial surface, a decision germinated. Ashira's explanation of the law contained more than doctrine. It contained history and pain. The ritual of untouchability had turned her into a symbol. It had protected her body at the cost of making her unreachable. She revealed that the crash had likely been an assassination attempt, a sabotage staged by Cord elements opposed to her rapprochement with the Terran coalition. Those who preferred conflict wanted the monarch to remain an untouchable face on a throne, not a collaborator. Liam listened, part doctor, part bewildered civilian, as ministers and fleet officers listed possible outcomes. He demanded guarantees, clear rules about his legal status, safety assurances, and limits on obligations that might be construed as lifelong bondage. His instinct was practical. He was a physician, not a pawn. Yet another instinct, the moral sort that had guided his hands inside the wreck, made him see a rare chance. If the Queen, whose status was enforced by distance, could be rehumanized by deliberate, consensual contact, perhaps the Caith polity could be nudged toward a new kind of diplomacy. Ashira proposed an experiment nearly as radical as the initial contact. Rather than punish him for sacrilege, she offered to take him to her palace as her personal physician. This would legalize the contact and allow him legitimate proximity to her person, essential not merely for medical reasons, but for what this could symbolize. Her suggestion was strategic and personal. It reframed the incident from crime to possibility. Human leadership chewed on the implications. Could a single doctor be a bridge between cultures? What were the security risks of embedding a Terran within an imperial household? Could a law be undermined without provoking a backlash from conservative factions that had already shown lethal intent? The calculus had variables no medical textbook had prepared Liam for. He agreed, but not without terms. He insisted on explicit protections, codified limits to the legal bonds the right of protection might create, a clear chain of command for his safety, and guarantees that his role was strictly medical. For Liam, the bargain was equal parts duty and conscience. The hard choice of someone who understood that sometimes the smallest humane act could ripple into tectonic political shifts. The shuttle's lift pads hissed with the sound of leaving. A frontier base relinquishing a crisis it could neither fully control nor fully understand. Arcturus receded in the viewport, tents and strip lights becoming trivial dots. For Liam, the outward motion was matched by an inward vertigo. He had moved from treating burns and broken limbs to entering an empire's intimate political theater, and every trivial habit felt heavy with consequence. Ashira traveled with the measured grace of someone who had spent years learning to appear untouchable. Yet there were moments, small adjustments. The way her gaze tracked Liam when he checked monitors, the almost imperceptible relief when his hand rested where it needed to, that hinted at a person beneath the icon. She touched his arm once before the shuttle sealed, a gesture so simple the rest of the cabin might have missed it. "You were being human," she said softly. "Compassionate, skilled, utterly unconcerned with who I was." The words were both praise and a quiet accusation against her own court's insistence on distance. Back at the base, futures were already being imagined and argued about. Some saw Liam's move as a dangerous precedent that could be exploited by adversaries. Others, diplomats who measured value by subtle social shifts rather than immediate gains, saw the raw potential for transformation. What would it mean if the Caith ruler could be approached as a person? What would it mean if rituals of untouchability could be dismantled without civil war? Arriving at the palace was nothing like what Liam had expected from briefing slides and sanitized diplomatic handbooks. The architecture grew from living material and ceremonial geometry, not blueprints. Courtyard forms held light in ways that made the building breathe. Guards watched with eyes that betrayed both suspicion and inherited duty. Liam felt the pressure of every precedent, every ritual that had accreted over generations, as if each stone contained a whispered commandment. Ashira's entourage moved with ritual precision, yet the queen's step beside him felt less set-piece than a deliberate rehearsal for change. They entered halls where portraits of untouchable monarchs watched from alcoves. The palace's etiquette had been designed to flatten personality into symbol. Liam's presence was an uneven, dissonant note, one the court might either absorb or attempt to silence. As the doors closed behind them, Ashira's hand found his again, not in public ceremony but in a private, intentional gesture. The contact held no jagged shock this time, only a new promise. Around them the empire hummed with rules and inertia. Between them sat a fragile experiment. Could simple humane touch begin to thaw a culture built on distance? The shuttle's wake behind them marked an ending and the first hesitant outline of a revolution that would not be announced with proclamations, but might spread through small acts of recognition and care.